Welcome to our podcast, A Novel Talk, co-hosted by Carl Lee, and I'm Wendy Kendall. My mystery book, Cat Out of the Bag, that's cat with a K, is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, and all over. Catherine Watson, an international purse designer and amateur sleuth, goes from designer bags to body bags as she's faced with a puzzling and intriguing mystery in her hometown of Bayside. Thank you to all the readers who've let me know how much they enjoyed the book. And here is your co-host.
Thanks, Wendy. My name is Carl Lee, and I write paranormal fantasy. My book, Selfies, will hopefully be out sometime next year. Wendy, I understand we have an amazing guest that you're going to introduce to us.
Oh, yes. Our guest today is award-winning historical fiction author J L Oakley. Janet Oakley writes historical fiction that spans the mid-19th century to World War II with inspiring characters standing up for what's right and timeless examples of the courage of individuals in different periods and places. Her writing has been recognized with several prestigious awards. Visit her website at jloakleyauthor.com to see her many impressive books, including mystery novellas set in Hawaii. When not writing, she enjoys outdoor activities and demonstrates 19th century folkways in schools and at San Juan Island National Park. Janet Oakley, welcome to A Novel Talk.
Oh, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I really love the idea of a novel talk because it really opens up so many doors to discuss about writing, maybe in particular historical fiction. And I do love talking about the research that goes behind my books, even the historic mystery novellas. I call them mysteries with history. And there's history that I've had to run down in those too. So this is awesome. I'm really excited.
So you mentioned research and how much you enjoy the research, which brings me to my first question. What drew you to write the Jostling affair? What about this period in Norwegian history drew you?
Well, believe it or not, it was a pure accident. I had a dream about a man in the snow surrounded by German soldiers. And it was so vivid. I was telling a friend of mine who happened to have an editing background about it, and she said, well, you should go write it down. So I did, and that became Prologue. Prologue has hardly changed at all. I've learned how to cut down words, but it's pretty much the way it was when I initially wrote it. And I gave it to her to read, and she said, you should write a novel. Well, I didn't know how to write a novel. And and I didn't know anything about Norway. My father-in-law was from Sweden, but I knew nothing about Norway, and I figured it must be World War II and it has to be Norway because there's a fjord and there's snow. So I went to the local library, and one of the first books I pulled out general histories of World War II, and there were a few things, on the culture of Scandinavia, not specific Norway. However, there was one book that was called Blood on the Midnight Sun. And I took that home, and essentially it was written by a professor at PLU and then his counterpart in Oslo. It was published in the 80s. And it is amazing stories, essentially, about all the things that are in the Jostling affair. The Shetland bus, I never heard of that. Conrad Bonnie Svensson, talking about the resistance in this particular aspect of the resistance. He was in a group called Seaborg. And how this minister that was, he ran the school for the deaf, and he's a minister, but it's a church-run school back then. And then Henry Oliver Renan, there's a whole chapter on him, and he was a monster. He was a psychopath, and he was Norwegian. And so that stirred up that sort of stuff. And then I think you had another question on the research, but essentially, that's what got me going. And it's actually become like a 26-year journey because I keep learning things. And I did start writing the sequel fairly soon, and then got sidetracked with Tree Soldier. But all that whole stuff has been here all this time, and I think I can be very confident saying that I think I know what I'm talking about now. I got an invitation to speak to the Sons of Norway Lodge out of the blue because they had reviewed a Jussing for the Norwegian American newspaper. And I got invited to go back there in person. And I was terrified because people in that group, they come from the Norwegian embassy. And there's people that are Norwegians in that area, and they're very passionate. And they told me later that was absolutely spine belt, binding what I had to say. And I said, I never heard of these things either. So I think I can say, I think I know what I'm talking about now. But I'm open to any corrections or any new things that I find out. So,
well, I have no corrections because I knew less about this period of history than you did, and it was very eye-opening and intriguing.
Well, very few people know about Norway. I think the Kirk Douglas movie that was made many years ago. I can't remember the name of it now, but it's about the heavy water rate. And there were a lot of things when I finally saw it that were not really right. A lot of stuff was added. I think there was a romantic interest in there or something that did not happen. But that's about my speed too. And I love the Vikings, which Kirk Douglas earlier, that was my girlfriend, my girlhood movie I love so much that was filmed in Norway. It's about, I think it's called The Viking. And I actually have the CD of it. It's kind of, well, it's not hokey. It's Tony Curtis in it. And it has Janet Leigh in there too. Very fun. But that was about all I knew. I didn't know anything of this. And people keep telling me that, all the books are about France or about, now you're seeing more about Poland. You're seeing a lot about Auschwitz, the home front in England, but no one is writing about Norway. So I think that's why it's working for me, because I really have my own niche. And people are responding to it. When I went to Trondheim to visit 2.5 years ago to do research for the sequel, one of my hostesses said that her best friend wanted to meet me right away. And so we met, and she read Jussing. She can read English very well. And the first thing she said, how did you get my town right? How did you know about Trondheim and you've never been here? Because you got it right. And I'm thinking, that was my next question that's coming up, is where did I get my research? I discovered 2 handbooks put out the British Naval Intelligence up at Western Washington University. And it is spy maps. It's where you can go get lunch. It's maps on bombing places, essentially. And there's a whole history behind that. It's absolutely fascinating how those volumes came to be. But that really helped me.
Well, unquestionably, the history in the book is just amazing. I learned an incredible amount while I enjoyed a really gripping story too. All people kind of keep innocent secrets, but when I was reading the Jussing affair, I was struck by the necessity for everyone during wartime to keep their own secrets in order to survive, and living in distrust of all others. Can you comment on the complications for characters knowing they can't easily trust anyone, especially the impact on your character Jens?
Well, because I'm an historian and I'm reading all this stuff, I knew that I had to interview people. So one of my friends, he still is the director of the men's Norwegian chorus. So they have people here in Bellingham, Everett, everywhere in between Everett. And he gave me the names of people to go interview. So I was mainly interviewing the men, but the wives would be maybe in the next room. And that was one of the people that I interviewed. I think it was Olesen, who was a fisherman. And he told me, he said, the trust is the 5th freedom. We think of the 4 freedoms, but he said the inability to trust anybody during this time period. It could have terrible consequences. And he said once the war was over, you could kind of relax. He said you could not even talk to your own brother or sister. Something would happen. And actually, that's one of the things that happened at Televogue. It's south of Bergen. It's on this very tiny little island. They have a wonderful museum there now. But it was constantly having the Shetland bus was coming by there and dropping things off. And some people were getting packages, like good coffee or careful things, but they're also dropping off agents and picking up maybe refugees. But this woman, the story goes that this woman was wondering why she didn't get her package. And she blabbed. And that's how they discovered the two agents that had been dropped off from SOE, which is Special Operations Economics, which was a special thing Churchill set up. And it led to this gunfight in a barn. 2 Germans were killed, and one of the resistance people was killed and the other one arrested. They razed that complete town. They burned it to the ground. They round up all the men. For some reason, 16 to 65 was the age group they'd like to take prisoners, male prisoners. A couple of men were shot right off the bat. The rest were sent to Schanzenhagen, I think that's how you pronounce it, in Germany, and very few came back. The women and children, some of the babies were separated, but eventually they got most of the mothers and their children together. They were kept on a ship and eventually at a school for 3 years. This happened in 1942. And so anyway, that was an example of saying something, and it had terrible consequences.
This is heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. I hope to go to I hope I can go back. They're not going to let Americans in now, apparently. But I want to go back to Norway. I have an open invitation to stay with my hostess again. She was lovely. But that would be one of the places I'd like to go. I'd also like to go to the Shetland Islands because they have a museum there. That's where all the secret operation came out of to send these boats over. But yeah, saying something could cost lives, and it happened not that infrequently. And sometimes it's an innocent thing. So you didn't dare say anything. I just listened to an author this last Saturday. He was on Zoom out of this lodge in D.C., and he didn't know his father was in the resistance until after he passed away. And he found all this stuff, and it turns out that he was in XU, which was that intelligence group. He would go up by their little village. Their house was way out of town, so they never got the terrible stuff going in town. But his father would go up on this rock and watch the movement of ships, write it down, take it down to the school teacher, who actually was the one operating the wireless. And he said, I never knew. You didn't even talk. A lot of people just did not talk. And it was so dangerous. When I heard his dad was in XU, I said, oh my God, that was one of the most dangerous jobs, because they had these gauges that would go around. They could pick up, the Germans could pick up signals and pinpoint you right down to your living room. So it was very dangerous.
Wow.
Wow, indeed. So you mentioned packages, and then you mentioned coffee, which is one of my favorite topics in the world. I love coffee. You talk about ersatz coffee several times in the book. Ersatz basically means fake or artificial.
Really fake. Yeah.
So what was Norwegian ersatz coffee, and can you tell us a little bit more about the packages?
Well, this is something you would get on rations. And actually, I was trying to find the recipe. I think they burned rye. It's really not something that you want to really drink. So apparently, I also drank a lot of tea, like, because they have a lot of raspberries and lots of berries in summertime. So they would be dried, and they make tea out of that. But that was something you would get with your ration. Of course, the Germans and members of the National Samling, which was the Nazi party in Norway, they would have access to coffee. And that was one of the things that the Shetland bus often brought over very secretly. You could be enjoying a great cup of coffee, but you had to be careful because the smell could give you away. So, but that might be in the packages. And the stuff that's parachuted in, it kind of like, remember those old metal tubes that you could get cigars in? My dad had those in the 60s and 70s. And these parachute packages look just like that. I think they're about 10 feet long, and it'd be packed. That's how parachutes would arrive on the Shetland bus. There'd probably be crates or something like that. But yeah, coffee's part of the rationing system. It was started pretty quickly. The first summer is very confusing for people, but by September, Terboven is given full control of Norway, and he was very good friend of Hitler, and he pretty much ran the country, even though Quisling was the ceremonial head. So they laid down a lot of laws during that time, and finally in 1944, so I had the Pascagoula boys, those kids that show up. There was an attempt to get the boys to sign up. This program they had called AT, I can't remember the pronunciation in Norwegian, but it actually been in existence for a while. It was kind of like a service program for youth. But when the Nazis and the Germans came in, they really turned it into more Nazi party type of thing. And so in 44 in the spring, they wanted to, they wanted the boys to sign up. Every young man had to sign up. And the fear was that they would force those kids to go to Germany and fight. So all these boys just took off and went up into the mountains. There were thousands in the mountains all around Oslo, Trondheim, everywhere. And they were fear of them starving because immediately before you would get rations, you would be to your family. So maybe the Andersons would get the ration card and it would serve everybody in the family. But they changed it so the individual had to show up. And that's one way they could do a head count, who's missing. And there was a great story about the resistance taking off after one of the trucks and stealing all the ration cards. Mm-hmm. And that put an end to it. They stopped. But ration cards, and then another thing that's part of this, not just coffee, but you had to have a pass to go everywhere. So it was forbidden to be in the mountains. If you wanted to go, say, visit someone in Bergen and you're living up in Lillehammer, you had to have a pass to prove that you had permission to do that. Everybody had ID you had to show. And especially for Haugland, he has a medical card that shows that he is deaf. And he has permission to move.
Well, Janet, I just have to mention, I keep every once in a while hearing this cute little bell every once in a while, and I'm wondering if we've been joined by your feline editor.
Yes, well, she's my intern, actually. It's Pinky Boots, and my son made me this incredible ramen, and she's discovered that there's fish in it. She's supposed to be eating baby kitty food, but that's her little bell.
I love that. No, I love it. Anyways, you beautifully weave, as we said, so much research into your books. And also I'm going to reference the picture that we have on this podcast episode of you in a museum in Trondheim. As an author, how do you craft the right balance between the historical facts and the stories of the characters?
Well, thank you for the comment about me weaving beautifully, because, that's a really hard thing to do. And I love the quote that Diana Gabaldon said at a conference years ago. I found some things, and now I'm going to drown you in it. And she did this wonderful workshop about working with historical facts. She's an expert on Scots. She really is. She would ramble on about law in 1730 at panels that I saw her. Surrey Riders was where I always saw her.
Oh, yeah.
And she, that's one of the dangers that you're going to do an info dump. And I always say, when you're writing historical fiction, you have your it has to serve the character. So, and so you need to know stuff, like you need a medical card, or you need to, what are you wearing? And I find one thing that's very helpful, those maps that I got initially, the spy maps, and actually the information, like you can get buffet at such and such a train station in this spy book. And there's also general history. One book is all about culture. It's about Norwegian. It's about law. It's amazing that these agents would have these books to read. And, but you have to know what they wore. So if you have photographs from the era, you want to know if you get your hands on any kind of newspaper accounts. Now it's more difficult if you don't know the language. I can read French sort of pretty okay. I was a student in France. Norwegian, I'm like at the preschool, kindergarten level. But I was able to go through a lot of the books. I finally was reading books. I got through interlibrary because I was teaching at Western. And I would get these incredible books, and they started coming in Norwegian. But I'd sit there with a dictionary. The man said, it was pretty fundamental, but I happened to know the names of a lot of people that were listed. So maps really help. Photographs really help. Of course, the personal interviews really helped. And we're to the point now that most people are gone. So you're maybe talking to people that have reminiscence of what their parents may or may not have told you. But I use those a lot. The interviews were fantastic. But if you're going further back in time, like some of my other novels, 1860 for one of them, you're reading diaries. You're also, again, maybe you're looking at graphics. One thing that was very interesting to me was that I was reading all about Norway in Time magazine and Newsweek, published here in the United States. And the Norwegian organization information group in Washington, D.C. were finding everything they could find out, and it was getting into the newspapers and into these magazines. And when I was pitching Yussing 24 years ago, the agents just sort of didn't get it. They said, "Why are you writing about Norway?" And I'm trying to tell you that Americans were very much aware of what happened to Norway. Norway became the poster child of a democracy that was completely overrun, but they started resisting the very next day, because I really enjoy Norwegian people a lot. And they're very civic minded. They're very law and order people.
It's such an amazing history.
Yeah. So, you have to, this whole thing about the balance, you do need to know what a person might be eating at the time. So actually some of the books I got, they were personal accounts. So a lot of memoirs were written in the 1950s that I was able to get interlibrary. Some of them were at Western, a couple more were down at our own library, but the rest came interlibrary, and sometimes they were articles. And they were very helpful in giving me an idea. The maps of Norway that were in that spy book, that's how I knew my way around Trondheim. And then you get more stuff. I wrote to the Auto Association of Norway, and I got incredible huge maps. So when I went out and visited with people, I always took the map. I always took flowers, because that's the European way. And then we sit down and talk. I was careful. I never recorded, because some of the people I interviewed, I was told, one family knew my very first interview had something horrible happen. She lost her entire family, 16 to 65. And she was north of Trondheim, I think. Her family was intercepting, parachutes, and she was only 12. And since then, people have told me many, many stories. But you have to, if you get really excited, like I had to have not Generator in my story. And then I started seeing pictures in Time magazine, of all places, of one on the back of a bus. And then you start reading accounts of people that are living it. They're writing about it later. I often ask people about that. And one friend, I interviewed her parents, and my friend was sitting with me. And first thing I said was, how did you dig for peat to light your fires? I knew they were from out all on the West Coast. She didn't know that. And then I asked him, well, tell me about the furnaces on the back of the cars. And she didn't know that either. And he started saying, and he said, yeah, I used to repair them. And then he also worked in an auto shop because his job, forced job, was to look after the automobiles of the German soldiers in Bergen. So you have to have a balance, and sometimes you have to take it out. I have critique groups that are really good, and I'm being attacked on my neck right now.
Somebody's getting their bell rung.
Yes, she's cute. Anyway, so they. Oh, now I lost my total train of thought.
That cat. That's why she's still an intern.
Yes, she's definitely an intern. She's learning the ropes. But really, that balance is really important. And my critique groups do help me say, that's a lot of interesting stuff, but how can you do that? So you have to make it sure that the character is walking. And like I said earlier, before we started, is that when you write historical fiction, just like fantasy and sci-fi, you are creating a world that has to make sense to the reader, but you have, as a historical fiction, you have to have things right. So that's the balance, I think.
Excellent. There's a lot of intensity, a lot of tension throughout this book. It is a white knuckle ride. Do you think that danger that permeates the entire story helped intensify other emotions, like the feelings that emerged between Jen and Anna?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the quote from the man I interviewed about trust is the fifth, and being able to trust was really one of the things that developed. Really, Haugland is very lonely. He's created this persona for himself. He's very lonely. He can talk to Shell, the one that looks like J-E-L-L as Shell is how you pronounce it.
Mm-hmm.
But he's very lonely in it, and he begins to trust her. But he also knows his position, that's not a good, cool thing to do, because he could jeopardize everybody. And of course, he worries about that. He certainly is aware of the consequences of drawing in this fishing family, and they do it willingly, but it has terrible consequences. And some of the things that are happening in there that are also real. With Renan, he was able I created this other character, which you're going to talk about, Odd Sorting, because I didn't know everything about Renan at the time. I didn't know all his movements. So I thought it'd be better to have a secondary character that would take his place, and he could be interacting. But actually, that's exactly how Renan worked. He'd have people go out. I mean, he had a lot of people on his payroll. And I think the facts I saw just a little while ago was like 70,000 a year. Or possibly more, the Gestapo gave Renan to work with his group. And so they go out in these communities and befriend people. Sometimes some people carried tapes of the king's speeches because they were read over the BBC, which was illegal. But he often communicated on the BBC to give people encouragement. But yeah, the tension, you don't know if you're going to trust her, not trust him. And all the people he comes in contact with, even meeting the school, he didn't really want to have any reaction with the local little group because that would expose him. His only person he was to work with Shell and his daughters. That was it. But he can't help because he's being drawn into this larger picture, and definitely dealing with the Shetland bus. By the way, when you plan this detailed part, I knew the arrivals of the Shetland bus. I got that from the Resistance Museum in Oslo, and so I could, you try to be as accurate as possible. So it made sense that this particular boat, the Hesse, would show up, and yeah, it was kind of in that general vicinity. So that makes sense. I can create a fiction around that, but it's pretty close. But yeah, the trust thing is all through the whole thing. I mean, all these different things that people keep interacting with him, and he's got to maintain his cover. He's got to maintain himself. And, you know, you have to finally trust. And actually, that comes from a story, a book I read about a man who pretended to be a Quisling. He signed up immediately with the National Samling right after the Germans invaded. He lived at the end of a very long valley that was a fjord that opened out to the sea, and he kept a radio up there. Even his own mother did not know that he was a Using, a patriot. And she was often talked at very cruelly in town. At one point, someone figured out his signal, almost came and found him. He almost took a pill and killed himself. But the last year of the war, he got pneumonia. And by then, he started trusting a local girl, kind of sharing, because again, this is such an isolating thing, and to have someone to talk to. And he ended up getting pneumonia, just like in the story. And she hid him in the barn of her house because they were looking for him. They finally figured out, the Gestapo, that he was not who he said he was. And after the war, he survived. After the war, he carried a letter from King Haakon saying that he was a Using. He kept it on his person all that time because that's how well he played himself as being a Quisling in order to get information to the resistance in that area. I mean, he was going to functions. He was even invited to watch someone get tortured, and it was someone he knew. And to maintain. Wow. And the interesting thing, and that caught my attention right away, he died in 1956. That's 10 years after the war. And I think he had severe mental issues, you know, PTSD, we would call it. So anyway, the tension is real. I don't think I could do it. I always write about people like this. I don't think I could do it. I'd be a terrible spy, you know. So, yeah.
I felt that too. The courage of people during this cruelest of times was really humbling. The hopeful optimism seems to come from sort of unexpected moments of kindness. At one point, your character, Anna, is touched. I'm going to quote your book. Anna's face crumpled. She turned her face away, trying to get a grip on herself. Just one small gesture of friendliness. She cleared her throat and brushed back a telltale tear. As an author, how do you present these everyday moments in such a way to surface the touching emotion hidden below the surface?
Well, I have to say that I've taken a lot of workshops with Donald Moss, and his latest book is on the emotional craft of fiction, but he's been talking about this for many years. I started taking workshops from him, I think back in the 80s, when he was doing it at the PNWA in Seattle. And I mean, that's one way you could help people relate. You know, if you lost your father and the character's grieving about it, you can relate to that. Or, you know, if someone stands you up for, you know, something, you could relate to that. In fact, one of the exercises that he had us do was tell the time when you got so mad at somebody and you finally forgave them. Well, I took the example when I was a student in France. We were supposed to take the train from Clermont-Ferrand, well, actually from Vichy to Clermont-Ferrand. We were going to start our studies. We've been working and honing our French for 7 weeks in Vichy. And this is when I was a student. And we were going to go down this car. Well, another guy took over the whole thing. And the next thing I knew, I was not in the car and the train had left. I was so mad. I could not speak English. I could not speak French. So I took that example and then I turned it into the time I forgave a family member. And so those kind of, that emotional craft of putting it into your, you know, into your story is really important to make the character relatable. And in Anna's case, people don't realize when the Germans first came in, they arrested every single American they could get their hands on. Some of them were able to escape. Some got into Sweden, and others got into not really the Shetland blows, but they've kind of figured out how to get out of here. I've had to open the door because the cat is starting to cry. But sorry, the intern is wanting something. I don't know.
The intern is restless.
She is restless tonight. Anyway, so that whole putting that in there, and so for her, she's hiding because she's an American. She's been accused of something that is totally foul. And the way they did they called the ice front during the World War II, where they would turn your back on you. They would not talk to you. And she's come up to this place that had belonged to her husband's family, and she's totally alone. And this friendship that she develops with Haugland, he's just there to do some work, and he's not happy about it. But eventually, I think he brings her fish, or just talking to him but he's lonely too. So that watching her, that's another interesting question. I found it much more easy to write about a male hero than it was the female. And I really had to get my handle on Anna and really try to make her as real as possible and not be some sort of, wishy-washy person. And it actually wasn't until, because I published this after I did the 2 other novels, by then I was widowed. And I realized that Anna is not crying enough. She's not crying enough because you go through all these emotions. She should be grieving for Einar, and her emotions are all mixed up and stuff like that. So she has this ice front against her. No one's talking to her, but he's starting to talk to her, and that was, it was a real turning point for her.
So it has been said that we are not the villain of our own stories. I was just wondering, what is Odd Sorting's, by the way, I love that name, view on his role in his story?
Well, I don't think feels like he's done anything terrible. He doesn't realize the consequences, I think. He's definitely an opportunist. And so one of the men I interviewed in Trondheim, the only one at that time that I met from Trondheim, he told me that he was assigned to all kinds of jobs. If you did not sign up, you could get into trouble. And the one that finally broke him is that he was an apprentice carpenter at the time, and he was signed up to work on this building that had three walls that were wood. The 4th wall was concrete, and he knew that it was for shooting people. So he figured out a way to get out of Trondheim without endangering his family and father, and finally got him down to Oslo, and he got over to Sweden. But so Odd, he's an opportunist, and because he didn't really want to do that kind of heavy work, he just he knew Rolf Rennen is a real person. He was the brother of Oliver Rennen. And so he just hung out with him and just sort of gradually came into it. So I don't think he sees himself as a villain. I'd see near the end, he did try to get away. But with this character too, you can't have a character who's black and white. And the thing that's astonishing for him is that the woman that he loved, and that's his only saving thing. I think he definitely cared for her, and that's the only maybe the good quality about him, because he was there to find people out. He's specially assigned to figure out who's getting all the messages out of the little village and try to break this ring that's working with the Shetland bus.
Mm-hmm.
So, but he doesn't really see himself, as terribly evil. He's not torturing people, although he's present. but he's not doing anything like some of the other gang members did. It was just horrible. Some of the stuff that was done was horrible.
You've spoken a little bit, well, about some of the dangers getting ready in your research about writing about an underground spy, which is featured in your book, of course. Is there anything else, any other hints about how you prepare to write about something like that, the whole spy work?
Well, I think I told you initially, once I started writing it, I ran to the library. I think really, some of the best things to read, you can start at Wikipedia. I don't recommend that. There are a lot. Go to a really good book and look at the bibliography. That can lead you to a lot of stuff. And I have to say, ask librarian on every library site. You will find someone who's wide awake at 2 a.m. somewhere in the United States that will lead you to books. I had a question about Quisling, and it was someone in San Diego that answered, and they were looking at stuff at PLU for me. So I had to do a lot of reading. I think I enjoyed, I really like Jason Bourne. The original books are really thrilling. And, I got really disappointed with the movies because they got rid of Maria and they changed her completely out. But actually, in the original novels, he's also dealing with trying to figure out who he is, and it's very dangerous. And I think I read some other spy novels because they were fun to read in the past. But I had to really rely on the historical accounts because I needed to know how that worked in Norway. And I read, SOE Norway. It's the Special Economics spy program. They had SOE France, SOE Norway. They were dropping people in Yugoslavia. And so you had to kind of understand that too. So it's really a lot of reading because you don't really sit down and talk to a real spy.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen.
What?
But so I had to really draw on what I had to find out, and I think one of the men, well, actually, this one man who was from Trondheim, I think he was in black market, but he was black market for the resistance. And he was he just kind of winked at me. He wasn't going to tell me anything, but he was starting to get into trouble. That's why he had to get out of there. But another person that I talked to, he was a fisherman. He actually helped transport things via this. They made this stuff out of seaweed that you could pack. They fed animals with it, and they could pack arms and stuff like that into. And there's lots of books. Sometimes relying on Life magazine, they put out great books on spies and stuff like that. So you get again to see the type of pictures of what the guns look like. And actually, the final thing that I did, just 3 months before everything shut down, I write at Starbucks, and one of my Starbucks buddies is an expert on all kinds of guns. And he just happened to have World War II guns that were used by the Gestapo and a couple of things. He took me up at the firing range, and it was amazing. I was scared to death because I'm working with live ammunition. She walked me through 4 different types of guns. The lightest one was a revolver that was used by the police in Europe and used in Norway and even in England. And then he got me onto an automatic. So he showed me how to put that in. And now when I watch crime movies, I watch a lot of Scandinavian murder mysteries. I'm watching them how they hold the guns when they come streaming into the room, because you don't put your finger in I don't even know there's a name for it, but the hole the trigger hole, you don't put your finger there. You put it on the side. So when you start watching crime, check out how they're holding their guns. So I learned a lot. So that actually helped because I got a real sense. Could you really, I asked him, could I hide that gun in my pocket? And he said, well, you have to be really careful because you could kill yourself. That thing could go off and your artery is right there and you'd be dead in 2 minutes. You'd bleed out. So he gave me a lot of tips. That's another way of figuring out spies and all that. Of course, during World War II, they had a lot of things. SOE was provided a lot of things for agents that were hidden, like exploding pens and even stuff that looked like cow pies, had bombs in it and stuff like that.
Those details are incredible. You have some interesting historical people in your family, including your great-grandfather, who was a Union surgeon in the Civil War. Can you tell us how the women in your family stirred your interest in family history during your childhood? And maybe some advice for other families on how to bring history to life for their children?
Well, definitely. I'm so lucky. My Nana, my mom's mother, was born in 1875, and she had my mother at 40. So I only met my Nana probably 3 times in my life, but she lived in Boise. We were living back east, and she wrote to me all the time and shared stories with me. And then Mom, growing up in Boise, the Oregon Trail went right by where they used to live, and her brothers were all doughboys in World War I. They were 17 years older than she was, so she was really raised as the only child. And they had their own adventures and stories, playing around that area. So because my Nana got really early on into the family history. She is a March, and the Marches came to Newburyport in 1638. And one of the adventures that we had that really sparked my interest was she couldn't fly. She was in her 80s, and she came all the way from Boise on the train. And then we went up to New Hampshire to go to where the March Farm is. The March Farm is near Greenland, New Hampshire, and it's not far from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And that's where the later March house was. The earlier one is a tavern that's in Newburyport. And the look on my Nana's face when she finally got to see, she started researching by lantern light in I think Gooding, Idaho, or by then they're in Boise, trying to figure out her family history. And to see the look on her face when she finally saw it, I'll never forget that look. And I think that listening to stories, and then her mother, Bongi, she came from, that was her family name. My uncles named her that in the 1890s. Bongi came from a Quaker family, and they went west in 1862 from Chillicothe, Ohio. I think that's where they're from. And they took off and went to Shawnee Mission, and they taught at Shawnee Mission School. So I'm starting to see stories of that. Finally got her account, Bongi's account, when she was, she must have been in her 80s when she started writing it. But it's just fascinating how they went west. And then when I actually wrote my thesis, I'm a historian trained. My undergraduate is in American history, and we had to write theses. So I wrote my thesis at the Library of Congress National Archives called Comanche Indians of Prisoners of War, and was going into looking at how the Comanches were treated in 1875 after they surrendered to the U.S. Army. I'm reading saddle reports and all this stuff. And then Mom, I was visiting the weekend because I lived in D.C. while I was working on the thesis. And my parents lived in Maryland. So I went home, and my mom said, I said, do you have any pictures? And Mom said, oh, just go down the hall. There's a box there. It's Nana's. I went down the hall, and in there are these incredible pictures. They're like postcards. They were done in the 1890s. They're showing Kiowa women having tea with a cow leg next to them on the blanket. There's Cheyenne women lining up for sugar rations. There's all kinds of pictures. It's just amazing. I couldn't believe it. And my aunt, my great aunt, was the one responsible for taking those pictures and developing them. So that definitely spurred me on. I've been really following my great grandfather. That's my dad's side. He was just an ordinary doctor from Western Pennsylvania who signed up 3 months before Gettysburg. He was a brand new country doctor, that signed up with the Medical Corps. And he was there from day one. So I went for the 150th, which was really thrilling. It was just amazing. His name is on the huge Pennsylvania monument that Pennsylvanians put up.
Touching.
So, but I have to say, I think it is the women in the family that definitely, Quaker women especially, that's the part of my Nana, my great grandma Bongi, they appreciated women. Women needed to have an education, which may not be true of a lot of other segments of society. But generally speaking, I would say in my family, on all sides, women were getting educations and, could read and write and do more than that. So on my dad's side, the Savages, Susan Savage, she wrote articles in the Atlantic, I think in the teens and the 20s. So definitely women tell that story. And sometimes it is the women who are looking for the story and then kind of go, okay, it's interesting. If there are any battles, maybe, but, not the subtle stuff, how did people live and, what did they care about? And I think women are more tuned for that. So I don't know. Ancestry is fine. You can delve into local historical societies if your families live in a certain way. The Library of Congress has some great sites that publish newspapers. And at one time, Cornell, I don't know what's happened to the site. They had an amazing site. It was all magazines they go back to 1820s that have been digitalized, and they're fabulous. In fact, I was an intern at the Smithsonian, and for my sophomore year at Kalamazoo College, this is in 1966, before I went to France. And I was given a room up in the annex of the Library of Congress, and I was to go through old newspapers. I think that is also the other piece that really spurred me. It helped me look at the stories the women in my family are telling and the bits and pieces I'm getting on my dad's side, because we have the journals of my great-grandfather. And those newspapers are fantastic because they have songs in there. And one of my favorite one was, I think it was a Harper's Weekly. They would have the center folder, not like Playboy, but it was always either the best cow or bull or sheep. It's like the centerfold in the middle of the newspaper. And then they have, the daily stuff, the ads, and sometimes they'd always have little things for what the woman could do and stuff like that. And that really helps you give a sense of that. So that's the other piece, is that you can go online, maybe your local historical society, but they have things you can look at. Another wonderful one are the directories. These are the POLK, P-O-L-K, and they did directories all over the United States, including their version in Hawaii. So when I wrote those Hawaiian novellas, again, it was the librarians in Hilo that told me where to go to the state library, where all these directories were digitalized. And that includes ads, it includes where people lived, and usually an overview of a particular area. But they exist for every little town in the United States. They're a great resource. You can find, maybe you might find your grandmother, and it might just say housekeeper. They don't say much about you, but sometimes in the early days, they seem kind of nosy. They'll tell you exactly what that person's doing, and the address. They kind of changed about 1930, I think, but some of the early ones are hysterical. They're funny because they just tell everything. They might even say, "Oh, she's a widow," But you get the ads, you get the sense. Sandburg is also another one. Sanborn. They went all through, I don't know, maybe starting 1890s, definitely even up to today. They did kind of like fire insurance maps. And your local historical society, or you may be able to go online and find that. But that's a great way, because sometimes it's fun to pin down where someone was. Like my father-in-law came from Sweden as an 8-year-old boy, and he went to Pittsburgh. I had the name of his aunt, who married a man named Pearson, And lo and behold, I have found the exact address in the Polks or where he was living in 1920.
Wow.
So those are great resources for people who want to, write their family stories. Sometimes people find their stories so complicated that they end up writing fiction. So, and I'm kind of doing that with one of my novels, which is about my great-grandfather starting at Gettysburg, but coming out west during the Civil War, because that's another unknown territory that's just absolutely fascinating.
Well, your story, The Jocelyn Affair, was absolutely fascinating. I was wondering if we could convince you to read an excerpt from it.
Yes, and I'll see how long this is. I'm going to try to meet your limit. But this is kind of almost halfway through the novel. But the Shetland bus came over regularly from the Shetland Islands. I think they could come in 12, 14 hours. Initially, they were actual fishing boats, and then the Germans caught on. So about late 43, Nimitz, Admiral Nimitz, American, gave the Norwegian government 3 submarine chasers. They were very fast. The Norwegian that worked on it, a lot of the fishermen continued to work on these buses. It was so regular, they called it the Shetland bus. So in this scene, they're waiting for the bus, and Haugland has gotten the Carlson family a spare. Sig is the matriarch. He's in his 70s. And Sverre and the other brother, they're in their late 20s, early 30s. So they're sitting around because they're waiting for the bus. So you must have seen a pig, Sverre's cousin said, Ole. He threw down his card on the table. Did you know, Jens, that seeing a pig before going out fishing causes a bad catch? I didn't know, Haugland answered honestly. Everyone burst out laughing, some making ribald comments about local lore, which led to ghost stories. It was 9:30 at night, and the Otta was out as far as she could legally go, but in sight of Skerries if she had to run. Shell and Haugland were crammed inside the crew's quarters with Sverre Harlison, his father Sig, and some of his brothers and nephews. As they waited for the arrival of the Hesse bringing them armed shipment from the Shetland Islands, they found space at the table, on the bunks, or on the floor, while Haugland the poet told ghost stories. Did you ever hear the dragon, Jens? Don't remember. The ship's lantern cast a deep shadow on Haugland's face. Does a dragon eat humans, or is that the name of the new German fish buyer? Sverre banged the little galley table with a flat of his hand and laughed. He turned to Shell. Obviously, this man's education is lacking. Jens, you don't want to see the jargon. He's a terrible being. Just hours before they were leave for the island of Hitra for their meeting with the Hesse, Shell was approached by someone he knew from export down to Christiansen Nord. I need your help, the man said. I have some people who need to get to England tonight. The Gestapo is looking for them. I radioed London and learned the Hesse was coming. Now 6 adults and 2 small children hid on Sverre's fishing boat, the Maria, drifting not too far away and deliberately kept dark. Somehow ghost stories seemed appropriate as they waited, hoping to be avoided by being sighted by an air patrol at this late hour. The dragon is being very unfriendly to humans, Sverre said. He's an evil-looking man, terrible to behold. He leaned out from the bunk where he was sitting and, spreading his fingers, framed his face with his hands. His teenage son, Tel, was all bug-eyed, but Holger sat on the other end of the bunch and chuckled, his pipe filled with the cramped space with sweet tobacco smoke. In a terrible storm, you can hear him laughing. Sverre shook his voice, swaying as he spoke. He sits on the keel of a half boat, sailing close to fishermen, back and forth as the boat rocks. Any fisherman who sees the dragon know his hour has come. He will never see us home again. When Sverre finished, there was dead silence. It's like that American boogeyman, Haugland thought. No one quite believed in it, but if you talked long about it, it got to you. The tension here is enough to break glass. Shell looked up from the chart. Our dragon's not a using these days, is he? After all, he is Norwegian. Maybe he goes only after Germans now. Sverre shook his head. Nay, the dragon's the dragon. He comes to every fisherman. Maybe he comes around the convoys up too, Tell said, his voice cracking. Maybe the Dragon sits on half a U-boat. An even weirder thought, Hagen nodded to Shell. Maybe it was time to stop and get back to business. Hagen was ready, wearing his spectacles and the cheek pads again. Let me see that list of refugees again, Shell, he said. Hagen looked at the list Shell had scribbled hastily. There were 8. Felbu and Jorgensen were 2 young illegal workers in genuine trouble, their arrest imminent if they hadn't left. Felbu had a wife and 2 small kids he was bringing along. There was a 52-year-old Fru Torvik, whose husband had been in Greenie concentration camp before he disappeared. Sverre's son was a boat mechanic in trouble with an NS party member at work. Bulan, the filing man, was a mystery. Hagen disliked him immediately. He was supposed to be from Brattvåg and had some connection to illegal work. His papers were in order, but when Hagen said he didn't like him, Shell and Sig agreed too. I don't like his bragging, Sig said. I don't like loudmouths. If you ask me, I'd say he's drinking enough, though I didn't get close enough to check. Shell frowned. There were supposed to be only 7. Bulan was added at the last minute. It seemed all right because Felbu knew him. Hagen tapped Bulan's name with his fingers. There was enough danger. If they were caught meeting with the Hesse, they would all be tortured and then shot. If his identity was discovered, his own death would be particularly ugly. But it could be also terrible consequences for Shell's entire family and his friends. He didn't begrudge taking the men and their women and children. The Shetland bus did it all the time, but not having Bulan checked out was unacceptable. Hagen stood up. I think I'll go look at Bulan's paperwork. The Hesse still. Something bumped against the auto. Hagen's hand dropped his pistol. Father, Kolbrun Sverre frantically jumped down the entryway of the crew stores. We need Jens. Come quick. Hold on, Sverre said. What's wrong? Bulan's drunk and he's threatening to take our boat and go back. Quick. Hagen was already to the ladder. He smashed down Kolbrun's cap as he came by him. Good work. Stay here with your grandfather. You coming, Sverre? Sverre and Shell came both. Outside, the sky was black with a hint of fading silver on the horizon. In the gloom, the Mario bobbed like a bulky gray shadow. They slipped cautiously over to her side, their oars already silenced with rags for the coming night's work with the Hesse. The boat was completely dark except for a glow near the scuttle. Damn it, Hagen thought. The Maria's leaking light. On deck, the men crept across the deck to the companionway, to the crew's quarters. Down below it appeared to be quiet, but on closer inspection, they could hear a baby crying. 2 voices argued. I said, the voice growled, I want to go back. The words slurred. It's not very smart about it. How are you pilot the boat, Gregers? No one can take you back at this point. The voice trailed away to the interior of the room. Hagen tapped Shell. Pay attention, he signed. You stay on top. I send up, boy. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you for that reading. It was, it brought me right back to that section of the story. I had to remember to breathe a couple of times. I loved that scene. I heard your new book, The Quisling, is out soon. Is that true? Yeah.
So the planned launch is July 30th. It's going to be virtual, which will be fun. It's going to be at Village Books. So. Because the store is shut down. It is open. You can go, 50 people can go in there now with masks. But having a group come and listen to you talk is just not in the cards. They think that it's not going to open for quite a while like that. So this they have a new application that they're using that they're really happy with, and they've already done a couple events. So I'll be doing that. I'm also hoping to have my cover done this week because I'm going to upload it. I've done all the spell checking and eyes on it. So I think it's good to go. It's in the book form, waiting to be uploaded. And then I'll order the books. And I'm really happy with the cover. It's a real place in Trondheim, Fort Christensen. It's so obvious when you come into the town. It's up on the hill. And its significance is that resistance workers were held there and then shot. And I was directed to go up there by my friend at the Justice Museum. He said, you'll look to one side and you'll see these row of doors, and that were the jail cells. And then he said, go up the little hill a little bit, and that's where they were shot. And then he said, don't go there. Go down to this other end because that's where Renan was shot. So Whistling Factor takes place a year later with some of the characters returning. And it's really about the echo of war or the post-war that we often don't hear about. You know, it's all happy times, liberation. But there's a lot of things to work out. You've got 260,000 German soldiers that have to be repatriated, 70,000 Russian POWs, and then the trials begin. So this is what it's about.
Excellent.
Well, Janet, thank you so much for joining us for A Novel Talk. Now you are part of our podcast history.
That's all, and my intern.
Yes. Listeners will want to check out your website, jloakleyauthor.com. And a thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and keep reading because a novel read leads to a novel talk.